to bring your practice into every single aspect of your life.
When we come to our practices with a sense of sincerity, coming into your practice with a sense of self-empowerment, I think is also very important.
It's not about how many books you have out or how many followers you have. You know, we all have the same value. We're all part of the same stuff.
You're not just healing that present situation, you're working through it in your past and your future. Your medicine could be someone else's poison, and their poison can be your medicine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Christian here, aka the Atlantean Alchemist, with
Viv, aka Lunar Faery Witch, or Continuous Death.
All right, let's get into this, guys. So, in today's topic, we're going to be talking about water magic and lunar magic. Getting into this topic a little bit as we're getting closer also to Halloween or Samhain for many of us. So, we're going to be talking a little bit on water and lunar spirits as well, covering, the lore behind them, which Viv will go into extensive detail on. But I just kind of want to introduce the subjects. So one thing that is a pattern I've noticed, especially in like mythology, and that's come up in my own practice as well, is the idea that water is the source of life. Most gods, especially love goddesses, seem to come from the origins of water. We even see it with a lot of theories as to human evolution, with mammals originating from water and coming into land, and us being 70% of water. So water is very important to us. And one thing that comes to mind when I think of this is also the works of Dr. Emoto. He is someone who works diligently on understanding the mechanics of water and how it changes with like our intentions and the energy that surrounds it. So his work, he spent a large part of his life researching different states of water, like when you freeze it and what it's exposed to. So he would render experiments like he would have people yell and say nasty things to this container of water versus he would have these other people saying very kind and loving things to another container of water. And he would write the word hate on one and the other one love. And then he would freeze the water. And what he found is the water that contained all those thoughts of like love and peace and things of such nature. When it froze in geometric sacred geometry patterns, versus the water that was filled with hatred was chaotic and had no pattern. And when we look at that, we also think of like the words that we hear on a daily basis. We're 70% water. So what is that doing to us when we hear words of affection and kindness versus words of hate? So that's something to keep in mind, and how kind of we can reprogram ourselves as well with the water that we drink and changing its energy as we work with it. So this kind of goes into the idea of gem elixirs and herbal infusions and kind of working different energies into water. With gem elixirs, generally with crystals that are safe for water would be the quartz family. Not really anything ending with ITE is a crystal that usually is either very soft and would break underwater or would dissolve in water. So you want to avoid crystals that end with ITE in terms of putting them in the water. But with gem elixirs, generally anything from the quartz family is really good. You can also try jaspers. I've tried agates in the past, but some agates are dissolve in water. So it's kind of, you have to play a little bit with it. But the biggest recommendation is to avoid anything ending with ITE because that avoids most of the toxic minerals. So quartz is really going to be your best bet also because our body does absorb silicon dioxide. So with these, when you work with quartz in these gem elixirs, so this could be rose quartz, citrine, amethyst, you want to be intentional. It's best to not use more than 3 crystals at a time and making sure that these 3 crystals actually get along energetically and harmoniously. So for instance, if you want to work with like love and intentions around like love and beauty, you may want to work with like carnelian and rose quartz together. Or if you're trying to build your confidence, you would use something like citrine, golden healer quartz, something like that to build your confidence. And there's many different kinds of elixirs you can create. Normally what you would do is you would leave it out into the water for about 24 to 48 hours. And then after that, you can drink the water. And then you could even make like lunar water, so you could put it out during a full moon or a different moon phase. Personally, what I like to do is just kind of draw down those elements. So, for example, like I know in Wicca they have an evocation called drawing down the moon, where you would kind of bring the moon into being, like in your space and time where you're at, and you can bless the water with the energies of the moon or any other kind of planet or energy, instead of having to wait a full 24, 48 hours for that water to absorb those energies. You call it in and you bring it down yourself, and you speed up the process that way. And you can kind of do the same thing with crystals as well. If you don't want to wait for 24, 48 hours, I find that it works just as effectively if you just kind of call on that energy and then push it into the water. It does take some energy work to do that. But before I go on, I just want to let Viv talk, and we want to talk about a little bit more about like water spirits.
So there's a rich body of folklore and mythology surrounding water. So some examples are Selkies, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the slightly lesser known, so I'm just going to touch upon beings other than mermaids and sprites that most likely everyone knows. So Selkies are these sort of seal creatures where in the water they're seals, and then when they come onto land, they take off their pelt and turn human or human-like. And these, seal people or these Selkies would often come onto land and take off their pelts, and there'd be sightings of them, and then if a human saw them, they'd put it on and jump into the water and turn back into a seal. So one folk tale of this was a man named Neil MacCondrum found and captured a Selkie, and she ended up becoming his wife, and they had kids, and the kids grew up a little, and they found her pelt and gave her back her pelt, and she ended up leaving and going back. And it's said that, while humans can capture Selkies, they're always going to want to go back home, and they're always going to want to leave. So, she left her children behind, but she wanted to go back home. So that was one folktale involving Selkies. There's also Kelpies, who are basically, they appear as horses near bodies of water, and they tend to look like regular horses. And if you touch a Kelpie or try to ride a Kelpie, and there's variations on whether it'll do this with just a touch, but if you touch a Kelpie, it is said that it'll pull you into the water, causing you to drown. So Kelpies are not to really be messed with. And there's also the idea that a Kelpie's bridle, if you get a hold of a Kelpie's bridle, it gives you magical powers, basically. And so there's folk tales surrounding that, where, a family got a hold of a Kelpie bridle and became extremely powerful magically. So those types of tales are very interesting. There's Jenny Greenteeth, who is said to lure and, capture children into the water. And, it's interesting to think of whether figures like Jenny Greenteeth were like a bogeyman created to, make children afraid of going near the water without their parents, and whether or not this kind of egregore developed around them, and whether or not Jenny Greenteeth is an actual spirit. So I think that stuff like that is really interesting to think about. And of course, we've also got regular water spirits around. For example, if there's a lake near your house, that's always going to have water spirits and spirits that you can work with. And I'd say the best way to connect with them is to visit whatever place this is often, or as often as you can. Pick up the trash, because people really be littering, and that's not nice. And that's not very nice for the spirits there, because it does affect them in a negative way. So I think one of the best offerings to do for local lake or river or whatever body of water spirits is to clean up trash. Put on some gloves, grab a trash bag, and just clean up for them. And this goes for any type of nature spirits as well. And you can also give them offerings, but they should be offerings that aren't littering and they're not going to negatively affect the ecosystem. So a really good one is like fresh flowers from your garden. Anything like that, anything like that's natural and that won't disrupt the ecosystem, you could give to them as an offering. So that's a really good thing you can do. And after you build a relationship with them, they'll help you out with your workings. And be sure that when you do start doing workings, keep that same energy. So don't dispose of non-biodegradable candle wax there, for example, because you spent all this time building a relationship with them only to start wrecking their ecosystem because your spell remains aren't biodegradable and they negatively affect the ecosystem. So just keep in mind that if you do start doing workings with your local water spirits, to keep everything as environmentally friendly as possible, because, you know, if I was a lake spirit and you were over here disposing of spell work that's going to disrupt the ecosystem, I'm not going to help you out with it. So just be sure that, you know, you keep all of that in mind. Water spirits are great to connect with because they're very unique based on each location. And we can talk about like location and how it affects like what the water does magically. But in terms of spirits, like river spirits are going to feel different from lake spirits. And then the spirits from one lake are going to feel different from the spirits of another. Ocean spirits are a whole other bag. But yeah, that's my thing on water spirits.
Yeah, you've made some really good points. Like, one thing I think that's a really good practice is if you're going to go do ritual by the lakes or any sort of body of water, or even just on land, clean up not only after yourself, but clean up the area as an offering as well, I think is important. I think it's just good ethics for them. And, you know, your offerings don't have to be big. Like, most spirits are going to be very happy if like you give them like stones, crystals, things like that. Like when I used to build a relationship with the spirits in a lake in my community, I would give offerings of like aquamarine and obsidians. So like sea glasses, anything that like adds onto the quality and the energy of the water, I think is important without it being polluted. And like one time I was working through like a lot of grief over situations, like with the passing of my great grandfather. I worked with Apache tier obsidian for about maybe 2 months. And then when I felt it was time and ready to let go, I made it as an offering to the spirits and I gave it to the lake for them to keep and to transmute that energy. So there's different ways you can do that and work with spirits. But the best way, honestly, is just having good ethics and cleaning up the area for them. I think, honestly, that's the best offering you can do for them because they already tend to the space. You should always add to the quality of the space that you are working with because it's a relationship between you and the land. And I did want to touch on lunar spirits as well, as there is this very big connection between water and the moon, as we know with the moon's gravity and how it affects water. There's many lunar deities, such as in Sumerian Mesopotamian, there is Sin or Suen, who is the lunar god of wisdom, who is said to be the father of Inanna. There is Uyomi, who is the lunar deity of Shinto, of the Shinto religion, and there is also Selene from Greek mythology. And then there's also many deities that are associated to those planets but aren't necessarily the embodiment of it. So like Artemis or Hecate, they are very connected to those, you know, the phases, particularly of the full moon, or I feel as though for more Hecate's more has to do with like the waning phases closer to the dark moon or black moon. And then coming back into the idea of like how water is a source of life and how I mentioned that there's many gods and goddesses that kind of come from water. For example, like Freya, her father is Njord, who is the god of the seas, who is about seafaring. And she has the name Mardal, which means shining one from the sea. So like the visual of looking out at to the sea, like during like sunrise or sunset and that kind of glistening of the water, that's where she gets the name Mardol from. And we see this as well with the story of Aphrodite, where she came from sea foam and rose from the fall of Uranos's testicles into the water after the whole Titan war against the gods. And then there's this weird sort of like play between like sex and love with water. And I feel like that also adds into the idea of like birth and like how love itself is water, if that makes sense. When we're also looking at the idea of it being in that formation where, like, you know, like I mentioned with Dr. Emoto's work, where it crystallizes and it becomes, and it appears in sacred geometry. Water is very neutral, but what it is sort of like water itself as a container for whatever you pour into it, which goes into the idea of like, you know, like creating war water, creating holy water. Our blessings, our intentions kind of makes the water into something else. And, you know, there's Florida water where you put in like herbal infusions and can make the water completely different to what it originally is. And Viv made a point about water from different locations and how, you know, like from certain different bodies, it has different effects because of the energy from that spaces and those different types of spirits in each of those locations. So like swamp water would create stagnancy, and water from like a river could probably bring prosperity because of the constant flow. And one thing I remember from my research on working with water from a river, you always take water from the river from the direction it is flowing, never against the current, because that can actually offend the water spirits of the river. So you have to take the water from the direction that it's flowing and not from the opposite direction. Even though it seems like an easier collection of water, you're going against the grain and the natural flow of that water, and that will upset the spirits that work there. But did you want to add on to this, Viv?
Yeah, sure. So different types of water have different properties, kind of like plants. You want to look at like the nature of the water itself. So for example, storm water is going to be, you know, that powerful energy that's good for baneful work or any workings that need a kick. Whereas if it's like a light summer rain, that the associations are going to be completely different. So it might be more for joy, for gentle workings, for happiness, that type of thing. And ocean water is pretty much good for anything, but especially kind of purification because, you know, it's very salty. And salt is associated with purification. But I would say it could also be associated with like life-giving properties, which would be good for any spell because you're giving life to the spell, because the ocean, you know, the ocean is like a mother pretty much. You know, the ocean is full of organisms, it's full of life, it's an entire ecosystem in and of itself. So I would also use it as like a symbolism for this kind of birth-giving energy. But of course, different people may also have different associations for these, but a lot of these are common sense. You know, swamps are stagnant, so it's going to deal more with stagnation, whereas rivers are the opposite. There's also, in terms of moon phases, I've noticed my work with Hecate has really made me work with the moon a lot more in terms of paying attention to each phase, because, you know, on the dark moon and on the full moon, I leave offerings for her. I do working with her. And so that's been very interesting to work with a deity with like strong lunar associations and just to feel my connection with the moon deepen by a lot. That's been a very interesting experience for me. The other thing I wanted to touch on is the fact that if you have a garden, if you work with herbs a lot, there's traditional like times of the moon for planting based on the phases of the moon, and that's something you could look further into and read up on and try out for yourself if you have a garden. But that's been a practice that dates back a very, very long time, where people used to plant with the phases of the moon, and it's kind of, you know, still a thing for some people, but I don't think it's a practice that's really emphasized a lot or talked about a lot in the witchcraft space or in the quote unquote green witchcraft space. So that's an interesting little tidbit as well.
Yeah, you made a good point. I did want to go into the topic of like ritual baths and showers. So a lot of people don't have a bathtub. I've been one of those people. So you could still work with the water in your shower. What I also like to do is call on the spirits and kind of attune the water to the energy of said spirit. So I'll do this with Freya. So I'll call on her. I have a special chant that I'll say to like call her energy in, and I'll tune the water to her, and I'll say that I ask like for healing or for purification or to feel more in touch with my beauty and confidence. And as the water runs, I'm being infused with her energy. So that's something that I do often. There's also the water spirit from the Goetia named Crocel. So I work with Crocel. I could speak his end and connect with his energy whenever I'm in the shower. Particularly for him, though, I like to connect with him in baths just because he's more of a spirit that's about like very much about ease, and water feels more like from a shower feels more like a river to me in the sense of its direction is very constantly flowing versus a bath is more stagnant. It's more effervescent, I want to say, but that's probably not the right word. And that's where I feel like I can really connect with his energy more. So a lot of people like to do ritual baths, like with bath salts. Like I have special bath salts just for working with Lucifer, and you could create your own bath salts. I've done that as well with all you need is like Epsom salts, and you could mix them in with charcoal and make black salts. And you can add in different protective herbs and oils and make like a protective uncrossing ritual bath. Just throw in some cloves, some anse, and it will do some really powerful things, honestly. I like to use bathing rituals mainly for purification and rebirth. So if you kind of like need that renewed balance or even grounding, like I know a lot of people use like black lava salts for grounding, which is really intense, especially if you're trying to do like shadow work. That's awesome. And those have been the best things that have worked for me, doing either both showers or baths. You could even do, like, if you have like a ritual bowl, you could do like a special face wash. You can do like special cleansing for your hands and for your face. I know, like, in Shintoism and as well as in more Hellenic religions, you would cleanse yourself in very special water. I believe within Hellenism, it's the burning of bay leaves. And then in Shintoism, you're supposed to wash not only your hands, but also your mouth and eyes, because what you speak to the gods is supposed to be cleansed before you approach them. And that's a big thing with like kegare or miasma that I find that works really well. If you feel like you're not able to really connect with them, or you feel like you need that extra oomph to make that connection, and certain deities and spirits, if you do not do that, will be offended if you do not cleanse beforehand. I did also want to go into the topic of like water magic in different states. So we talked about water itself, but we haven't talked about the other states. So there's working with water in the form of ice or its gaseous state. To work with water in its gaseous state, you are going to, so for example, like fog, for example, fogs, when you think of fogs, the mental image that comes to mind is like crossroads, confusion, illusions, protection, concealment. You could work with fogs in those ways, either for yourself or for others. You could work with, like, let's say, your mirrors. You could do mirror magic with the gaseous state of fog, where you would create sigils over the mirror using the vaporous water. To create sigils, you could do it on your glass of your shower, you could do it on the mirror in your bathroom, or any sort of special sacred mirror. You could work with water in that sense.
So one way you can work with ice is that you can freeze and bind an enemy. Now, freezer spells have been a part of multiple folk magic traditions throughout different cultures. And one way you can do this is by doing the binding. So, you take a picture of them. However you bind them, you do that, whether it's with yarn or, whatever process that you'd like to use. Some people, what they'll do is that they'll put them in like a plastic tub of water and then stick it in the freezer, and that way that ice actually forms around the picture. I think that's a really good way to do it. Some people will just put the picture in a Ziploc bag or something and put it in the freezer, but I do think putting that in the water and having the ice, like an ice block, form around it is a really great way of freezing an enemy. You can also do this with a situation, so with a representation of a situation that you want to bind, you can use that exact same technique, except it's a situation or a habit, like an addiction or anything that's not a person. It could be that as well. That's a really useful spell to know how to do. On the other hand, you can do the opposite, where you can melt ice in order to unfreeze something. So if you have like a situation that you want to unfreeze represented within a block of ice, as that ice melts, that situation will dissipate, or it will become unstuck or unfrozen. So there's like those two flip sides of using ice, which is really interesting. Snow magic is cool for that too. I think snow magic is really good for the second method I talked about, where you're unfreezing or unbinding something, because it's going to melt pretty quickly, and it's easy to get. So you can also do that. Another way, honestly, I like to use snow magic on the rare occasion that it snows where I am, is that I do like to use it for like Yule workings, or if I want that cozy wintry feel. This is my association personally. Some people hate snow, so for you it might only be baneful, but for me, I also associate it with good memories. So for me personally, kind of like we talked about personal correspondences, I think in the last episode, snow might be used for something that's more of like joy or associated with Yule, or in a Yule ritual bath, something like that. So snow and ice are really great to work with as well. So you can always do that.
Yeah, whenever I think of like ice magic, I always think of like healing a broken heart. Like the idea of like freezing your heart over and having it thaw out, kind of like a recovery from like winter into spring. I always love that visual representation when I think of like working with ice. And that's a good tip for you guys that ever have a broken heart. Just whip up some ice magic and let it thaw out. It really helps. And then I also wanted to go into the topic of like moon phase magic. So a lot of people have different associations for different phases of the moon, and then there's some general consensus of like what goes down. So like, for example, waxing when the moon is increasing, you have spells are gaining momentum, energy is being poured into that situation. So this could be an increase in finances, an increase in health, an increase in love, an increase of anything. And banefully, you could even use it to increase illness or anything like that. And then wanning is when you want to release something like addictions, or trying to release a situation, or an uncrossing, anything like that is really good on a wanning. Where there seems to be some confusion is between the new moon and the full moon. People tend to have different associations. The only thing I can say for like me personally, I view the new moon as like planting a seed in the darkness, and then as it builds up, as it's waxing, that's the energy of that spell kind of being birthed and growing, and then reaching its climax of manifestation during the full moon. That's how I've always viewed it. And then like the day after the full moon, you could do a lot of release work. But generally, I don't do a lot of work on the full moon. I tend to work more with the new moon and the black moon. And then there's people who feel there's a difference between the black moon and the new moon, where the new moon is the day right after the black moon. And some just feel it's just when it's at its darkest point, at that starting point. What about you, Viv? How have you worked with lunar magic in those phases?
So I definitely agree with the waxing moon for manifestation, waning moon for releasing. For me personally, on the full moon, now recently I've been doing more because Hecate, I've started working with her. There's a ritual in the book Hecate, Goddess of Witches by Courtney Weber that I really like, where you literally just stare at the full moon in the full light of the full moon and chant Hecate's name for 10 minutes. Puts you in a deep trance state and allows you to connect with her, especially when you first start working with her. And I love that trance state it induces. I tend to work with the full moon in that way where I'll sort of use it as a focal point and induce a trance state. The other thing I like to do is a full moon tarot spread. Now, I'm not quite sure the original source of where I found this or if I like modified it. So, just keep that in mind. I'm not like plagiarizing. This is just something I've written down in my book of shadows and something I do every full moon now and something I found a long time ago. But it's basically you draw 6 different cards. It's a tarot spread. The first question is, what have I created and manifested since the new moon? The second question is, where am I now? The third question is, what is coming into my conscious awareness? The fourth question is, what is no longer serving me? The fifth question is, how can I release and let go of what's no longer serving me? And the sixth question is, what can I utilize in order to help me release and let go of these energies that I no longer need going forward? So that's a really good tarot spread that I found helps a lot, that I like to do on the full moon. In terms of the dark moon, where I'm one of those people who sees a difference between the dark moon and the new moon. I just feel different energies. The dark moon, obviously, I work with Hecate. I pray to her and I leave her an offering at a crossroads near my home. Dark moon is also, I believe, a good time for banishing. It's a good time for cleansing. It's a good time to do all of that so you have a clean slate when you start manifesting on the new moon, if you choose to do so. And then like right after that, when you start getting that like that small increase, that's when I'll do manifestation magic and, let it sort of make its way and increase up until the full moon. I also sometimes do manifestation magic on the full moon, but I tend to focus on that trance state, those trance state rituals and divination. I find that those feel right to me. But I do think that utilizing the power of the full moon for spell work and for manifesting something is definitely something you can also do. It's not like something that's bad. It's just some people choose to do that and some people don't. So that's how I would work with the lunar phases.
Yeah, and then expanding on that, I want to go into like the zodiac signs with the lunar phases. So I'm pretty intermediate with astrology. I'm not adept. I'm not someone that would title myself an astrologer. So I'll give you the best examples I possibly can. So for instance, if the moon is waxing and it's in Taurus, that's a great time to increase your finances. Same thing with Capricorn, but Capricorn would be more in the long term. So Taurus would be more short-term boons of wealth, like increasing your finances as they are from where you're at. And Capricorn would be long-term plans. So that would be like investments, putting in money into the stock market and having that multiply for the long term, like a big goal of like, setting up your own business or anything like that. Capricorn works really well for that. Then the idea of like working with Scorpio for releasing addictions during a waning moon, or a full moon in Pisces or full moon in Cancer to increase your psychic abilities. So you're going to notice that like water signs tend to be more the psychic ones that we can work with or for releasing. Fire signs tend to be more for the creativity and confidence. So like a good Leo moon, a good Sagittarius moon, a good Aries moon. And then your air signs are going to be more like increasing inspiration or sort of also increasing your understanding or perspective over situations. So it's also really good for like shadow work and contemplation. And then your earth signs are going to be good for that steady growth on something, usually finance, but it can be worked with for other things. So that's to give you guys some ideas on how to work with them based off the zodiac signs that they may be in, because that also plays a big part in the magic that we can cast during those phases.
Yeah, for sure. And those are a really good way to like add a layer on to your moon magic practice, or, not a moon magic practice, but the presence of moon magic within your practice. So this was all we have for today. I hope y'all enjoyed this talk about water and moon magic, And, you know, I really enjoyed this topic because I think that water and moon magic and the intersections of both are really fascinating to explore. There's always new layers to be added, new folklore and mythology to learn about, and new things to add into your practice and experiment with. So I hope you all enjoyed listening to this as much as I enjoyed recording it with my lovely co-host. And you can find me on YouTube as Lunar Faery Witch and other platforms as Continuous Death.
Thank you guys so much for listening in. You guys can find me as the Atlantean Alchemist on YouTube, on Twitter, and I hope to see you guys again in the next episode. This one has been really fun to see that intersection between water and lunar magic, and I hope that inspires you guys to work with either one or the other or both together. And I'll see you in the next episode, guys. Thank you so much for listening in.